You will hear the introduction to a lecture on consumer habits. First, in the exam, you will have 20 seconds to look at questions 1 to 4. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 4.
Good evening, everyone. This evening, I'm going to continue last week's lecture by talking more about how people spend their money. First of all, I'm going to compare how people of different age groups spend their cash. You probably know that there's a lot of difference between what young people do with their money, how families spend their money, and what more mature people do. Secondly, I want us to think about what we imagine men and women spend their money on. And then, I'm going to look at male and female spending patterns and see whether we were right. OK, to start with, let's divide the population into 3 sections. Let's say young people up to the age of 30 in the first group. Then, let's put families in the 30 to 55-year-old group. So that puts adults over 55 in the mature group. Does that make sense?
Before you hear the next part of the lecture, in the exam, you will have 20 seconds to look at questions 5 to 10. Listen and answer questions 5 to 10.
Right, well, I found that the first group, that's young people up to the age of 30, mostly spend their money on clothes, music and entertainment. That's not really very surprising, is it? Although I must admit, I thought they might spend a lot on cars and travelling around. So, the next group is what I've called families, people in the age group from 30 to 55. Naturally, as I expected, this group spends most of its money on food, toys and trips out. But I was surprised to find that people aged between 30 and 55 spend most of their money on furniture and kitchen equipment. I suppose it's logical if you think about it. People are usually improving their homes at that age, and household equipment is very expensive. But they also spend a lot of money on electronic equipment, like video games for the children. Now turning to the third group, that's people over 55. I thought they'd spend their money on gardening tools and electronic equipment, but I was wrong again. People in the over 55s group spend most money on new cars and days out. So, what did we think about how men and women spend their money? OK, well, we thought that young women would spend a lot on clothes and shoes, and that young men would buy more electronic equipment and cars. Well, when we look at the figures, we can see that we were right about the men. Young men spend twice as much as women on cars and computers. But, and this is interesting, we were wrong about the women. I was surprised to find that young women spend much more on beauty treatments than they do on clothes and shoes. So we'll have to think about that again. And there's another interesting fact about young women. It looks as though young women are much more concerned about their diet than men. We found that although young women don't spend as much as men on eating out, they do spend a lot more on organic foods than young men.
That is the end of section
Now turn to section 2 on page 54. Section 2. You will hear a man talking on the radio about dogs which help people with their work. First, look at questions 11 and 12. As you listen to the first part of the talk, answer questions 11 and 12.
Welcome to this week's edition of Countrywide. And today, we're taking a look at a number of different breeds of working dogs. And here to report on the dogs with jobs is Kevin Thornhill.
Thanks, Joanne. Well, yes, dogs with jobs is the subject of today's program. Dogs have earned themselves a reputation over the centuries for being extremely loyal. And here's a little story which illustrates just how loyal they are. Just outside the country town of Gundagai in Australia is a statue built to commemorate a dog. A dog which sat waiting for his owner to return to the spot where he'd left him. Well, the story, which was immortalised in a song, has it that the poor dog died waiting for his master, 5 miles from Gundagai, which is where they built the statue. Now that's what I call loyalty.
Now look at questions 13 to 20. As the talk continues, complete the table for questions 13 to 20.
Well, because of their loyalty and also their ability to learn practical skills, dogs can be trained to do a number of very valuable jobs. Perhaps the most well-known of working dogs is the Border Collie sheepdog. Sheepdogs which work in unison with their masters need to be smart and obedient, with a natural ability to herd sheep. Some farmers say that their dogs are so smart that they not only herd sheep, they can count them too. Another much-loved working dog is the guide dog, trained to work with the blind. Guide dogs, usually Labradors, need to be confident enough to lead their owner through traffic and crowds, but they must also be of a gentle nature. It costs a great deal of money to train a dog for this very valuable work, but the guide dog associations in the UK, America and Australia receive no government assistance, so all the money comes from donations. Another common breed of work dog is the German Shepherd. German Shepherds make excellent guard dogs and are also very appropriate as search and rescue dogs, working in disaster zones after earthquakes and avalanches. These dogs must be tough and courageous to cope with the arduous conditions of their work, and so that they can be sent anywhere in the world to assist in disaster relief operations, effective dogs and their trainers are now listed on an international database. When you arrive at an airport here, you may be greeted in the baggage hall by a detector dog, wearing a little red coat bearing the words "Quarantine." These dogs are trained to sniff out fresh fruit as well as meat and even live animals hidden in people's bags. In order to be effective, a good detector dog must have an enormous food drive. In other words, they must really love their food. At Sydney Airport, where there are 10 detector dogs working full-time, they stop about 80 people a month trying to bring illegal goods into the country. And according to their trainers, they very rarely get it wrong. Another famous working dog is the husky. Huskies, which originally came from Siberia, have been used for decades as a means of transport on snow, particularly in Antarctica where they have played an important role. Huskies are well adapted to harsh conditions and they enjoy working in a team. But the huskies have all left Antarctica now because the international treaty prohibits their use in the territory, as they are not native animals. Many people were sad to see the dogs leave Antarctica, as they had been vital to the early expeditions and earned their place in history along with the explorers.
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to Section 3. Section 3. You will hear a conversation between two students discussing an assignment. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Hi, Opal. Any ideas about what we should do for our geography project?
Hi, Perry. Yes, I'd like to do something on wetlands.
I think that's a great idea. Where do we start?
With a definition, of course. Something like a marshy area of land where the soil near the surface is saturated or covered with water, forming a special habitat for wildlife.
And we could add, the flora and fauna of the area are reliant on the waterlogged soil for their survival.
Yes, that's a major problem, actually. When commercial developers or farmers come along and decide to drain the swamps, everything dies. The practice is all too common, unfortunately. Did you know that as a result, wetlands are recognized internationally as one of the most threatened types of habitat?
That's right. We'll have to be sure to discuss their importance in our assignment.
But first, I think we should state some of the particular characteristics of wetlands.
Well, there are 3 that I can think of. To start with, wetlands are limited areas of open water, which vary depending on seasonal fluctuations.
Yes, and the second could be that there's usually a variety of water-tolerant flora on the banks and throughout the water.
Of course, depending on the time of year, there may be more or less water, but levels generally remain quite shallow.
Okay, now let's move on to the importance of wetlands.
Shall we start with plant and wildlife habitat?
Yes, I think we should point out that wetlands are homes for countless species of water birds, frogs, invertebrates, and fish.
And they support many varieties of water-loving plants.
Which brings us naturally to the topic of biodiversity. Even small wetlands act as borders between land and permanent water. They turn into refuge areas or sanctuaries in times of drought, and they often support rare and threatened plants and animals found nowhere else.
Exactly. And they're especially important as nurseries and breeding grounds for all kinds of fish, birds, and invertebrates.
Wetlands are important for improving the purity of the water, too.
Yes, that's because the flow of water through the wetlands is slowed by bank and in-stream plants, and so it allows sediment to settle. Nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus and other pollutants are removed as the water passes through.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
Okay, at this point, I think we should look at mangroves. They're important for nutrient removal.
I think nutrient recycling is more accurate, and biological productivity, because wetlands are really very productive ecosystems.
Should we do a food web then?
We should do a diagram of some sort showing the importance of mangrove trees, but maybe not a food chain.
How about you explain it while I try and sketch it?
Right. Well, let's start with the mangrove trees. They're very special because of their aerial roots that allow them to breathe even when the tide is high and their roots are underwater. They can live in salt water, and the salt enters through the roots, travels up to the older leaves, and then these die and drop back into the water. A unique feature of mangroves is their ability to develop leaves on their seeds while they're still on the tree, and the seedlings drop down, planting themselves directly into the mud underneath.
Got that. What happens to those older leaves that fall?
The fallen leaves, or litter, decay in the water and form a rich mud that feeds bacteria, worms, and small crustaceans.
You mean things like prawns and crabs feed on the decomposed leaf?
Yes, and even little fish do as well.
And bigger fish feed on them?
Eventually, the remaining organic matter, which is now just very tiny particles, is taken up through the root system, providing nourishment for the mangrove trees.
And the cycle begins all over again.
Yes, that's exactly it. That's what we'll call it, the nutrient cycle of mangrove litter.
Great. I'll go home and work on this, and we'll meet again tomorrow.
Okay, see you then.
That is the end of Section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to Section 4. Section 4. You will hear part of a lecture about tea tree oil. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40. So, what I'm going to talk about to you today is something called tea tree oil, which was first extracted from Melaleuca alternifolia in Australia. This species remains the most important commercially. Several other species are cultivated for their oil extraction. There is a very long history of tea tree oil's use in aromatherapy. Traditionally, Melaleuca alternifolia leaves were crushed and the oil was inhaled by the Aborigines of Australia for the treatment of coughs, colds and also for the treatment of wounds. For instance, they chewed the young leaves to alleviate headaches and took them to treat sore throats or skin ailments. The Aborigines world was discovered by Willem Janszoon, a Dutch explorer who was the first European to sail to Australia. In 1606, he reached the northern coast of Australia in his ship. Then several voyages of exploration followed in the first half of the 17th century. The Dutch found it a paradise on earth for man's well-being, with timber, stone and lime for building. There was also plenty of salt, and the coast was full of fish. Besides, they found the characteristics of the diet there because they happened to meet 10 naked black aborigines having a meal in the open air. While the value of tea tree oil originated from Australia, it was gradually known and tested by the outsiders. In the middle of the 18th century, Sir Hugh Palliser, an officer of the British Royal Navy who had been to Australia several times during that period, got serious injuries all over due to his experiences in several wars. For more than the last 15 or 16 years of his life, he seldom laid down on a bed because of the constant pain in his leg. Then he tried tea tree oil, as it was said that tea tree oil could operate as a very powerful immunostimulant for pre- and post-surgical care. The use of the name tea tree, also called paper bark trees, probably originated from Captain James Cook's description he made soon after he had arrived at the coast of New South Wales in 1770. At the time, he witnessed some aborigines of Australia using one of the shrub's leaves to make an infused drink in place of tea. In the 1920s, some human clinical research and the documentation of many benefits associated with tea tree oil were credited, which were made by Dr. Arthur Penfold, an Australian government chemist. He investigated the business potential of a number of native extracted oils, then reported that tea tree oil was promising as it exhibited powerful antiseptic properties. But after World War II, the entry of antibiotics declined the use of natural products in medicine, which had a negative effect on the production of tea tree oil. As such an important and valuable material in the world, how is tea tree oil produced? I think most of you are curious about this. Tea tree oil can be extracted in some different ways, but the most traditional way is steam distillation. Once harvested in winter, when the amount of required essence in oil meets the needs for production, the finely cut trees are transported to a steam distillation facility. The extraction is made by distilling the leaves in specially designed stainless steel stills, along with the stems, to yield pure oil. The water-filled boiler is heated and constantly monitored to maintain the correct temperature. Both the steam and oil evaporate and then condense as they run through a pipe into the collecting container where the oil floats to the lid, while the water, because of gravity, goes steadily out the lower exit pipe. At the end of the hour, the oil is siphoned off through the upper pipe, while the condensed steam floats through the lower pipe towards the ground. At the end of each distillation, all the spent plant material is hauled out of the still pot by hand with a short rake, piled onto a trailer and spread where required as a thick woody mulch. That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.